it's a sad lesson that everybody would be very, rah-rah when we were all putting this stuff together and helping, save the world. Afterwards, people go back to their lives.
Contract manufacturing is navigating through turbulent times. Caught between the after effects of COVID, changing legislation, and the still to be fully realised promise of groundbreaking new treatments, it's a sector that's had to show real resilience at the same time as keeping its potential for the next phase of growth. To make sense of what's happening, I spoke to Gil Roth, founder and president of the Pharma Biopharma Outsourcing Association, a non-profit trade group that advocates tirelessly for the business interests of CMOs and CDMOs. Prior to that, Gil was the founding editor of Contract Pharma magazine, and his involvement in the CMO/CDMO sector dates back to 1999. I hope you enjoy the episode. Gil, welcome to the Pharma Source podcast. Judging by the PBOA newsletter, you always seem to be one of the busiest people in the industry. Is that fair?
I like to think so. I work really hard to do this sort of advocacy for the industry because historically, and I started the association in 2014, historically, there was no seat at the table for CDMOs. They did not have representation. They didn't have a consensus voice. They didn't have an association of their own. So that was my whole impetus for forming this, was to just, how do we make sure FDA knows what the CMO perspective is? And I was naive enough to think that's all that would be involved, and then discovered you really need to work with legislators before things ever get to the FDA. So I had to register as a lobbyist, start working with Congress, deal a little bit with the White House, with executive administrations. But yeah, it's one of those things where things that seem like they're great ideas from a policy perspective, like not necessarily pharma, or even from a pharma in-house perspective, might not be good for the CDMO world. It might be damaging to the manufacturing infrastructure. So it's one of those things where I'm like, I get where you're coming from. I get why you think that's a great idea. Here are the problems. We had this with Health Canada. They wanted to basically add a requirement to get your establishment license, that you needed to have the source of all the API material coming into your facility. And the CMOs were like, we don't always know that. Sometimes it's coming from our customer. They're the importer of record. We don't have anything. And if you make this mandatory, that might be really damaging to the sector. We know you want a better idea of where API is coming from, but you should put that requirement on the license holders of drugs that are made here, not on the CMOs or just facilities. Again, something that seemed well-intended. Well, these facilities receive the API. They must know where it's coming from. Turns out to be not so obvious once you're actually inside the sector.
Do you still feel that CDMOs are underappreciated, that they're not taken as seriously as they should be, considering the life-changing medications that they're producing?
I would say with the pandemic, there's much greater awareness of the CDMO sector. They heard the name Catalent for the first time when it came to manufacturing Moderna and J&J vaccines. And there started to gain a greater appreciation, I'll say, of the contributions CDMOs make. People started to understand that not everything especially not everything with a Moderna label on it is made by Moderna, because it didn't own much by way of commercial manufacturing capacity. So they started to get a general idea that there are other companies out there making the dosage forms of drugs. For a long time, there's been an understanding that, the APIs, key starting materials, chemicals, and all that stuff are coming from other companies. And that's become a flashpoint as far as global trade and supply chain interaction goes, which has been a big part of what I've been involved in for the last couple of years, especially. But yeah, I would say people get that CDMOs exist. They still don't understand the differences sometimes. We've been working with Congress on some drug shortage policy issues and really getting them to helping educate them about the role that CDMOs play and how our business models are different than pharma, whether it's innovator or generic. That's been part of our role, really, just getting them to understand we're not making pharma money. We're not Humira sized or anything. But the line I used to use with FDA when we were first starting out was, we know we don't drive the bus, but the bus doesn't go anywhere without us. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that really, kind of summed it up. They started to get okay, you guys aren't leading this whole thing, but, you're critical to actually developing and manufacturing all these things.
So presumably you're spending a lot of time at the moment lobbying Congress and getting involved with the FDA around these various new pieces of legislation which are working their way through Capitol Hill. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that and what are those initiatives going to look like?
Certainly. There are issues that have been made public. There was a drug shortage hearing just last week by the House Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee around drug shortages. There's a lot of questions, and I'll say ideas around shortage legislation and better understanding the supply chain for drugs in the U.S. is something that predates COVID, although certainly with the pandemic and everything that's come since, we've seen greater supply shocks in terms of import bans, lockdowns, et cetera. And now, there's a greater urgency, I think, in just trying to understand what supply chains really look like. And again, this moves away from the dosage form side, which we primarily represent, although a number of our member companies are also in the API space. With finished dosage form is a greater clarity as to who's where, what the manufacturing landscape looks like. With APIs, it can be a little more difficult, partly because of multiple degrees of importation, things going from one country to another before they reach a destination of conversion into dosage form. So there's been more interest in getting FDA authority to get greater reporting from manufacturers or drug license holders about the origins of their products, where things are originating, to get a greater understanding. They frame it around helping in relation to potential drug shortage mitigation strategies. But I believe there's also just a basic attempt at understanding how reliant is the U.S. drug supply on other countries, whether they're friendly or not so friendly.
Right. I mean, that seems to be the moon music, isn't it? It's pretty much a trade war.
Yeah, they don't say it out loud. Yeah, and it's not officially that, but it is an attempt at understanding, what that degree of reliance is. Like from an FDA perspective, they know where all the facilities are. They do not know necessarily how much volume of API or drug product or other stages are coming from those facilities. So this is an attempt, and it came up in the 2020 CARES Act, which was the first COVID relief bill. It gave FDA authority to mandate that every API and dosage form site report volumes produced each year of each drug or API that they make. This took a while for them to issue a guidance. The guidance wasn't great. Apparently, the data input platform needed some work also. So it's been a work in progress for FDA in 2022 and beyond, as they've been getting the data from facilities for 2020 and 2021 and then subsequent years. They reported to Congress that only, I believe, 44% of facilities actually complied with the reporting requirement.
Okay.
They did not break that down. This is public. I'm not giving anything away. They didn't break it down particularly well in terms of regions that did or didn't. They provided a few graphs on representation. Of the numbers that did report, X percent came from this country, Y percent came from that country, but they didn't push that back against their total inventory of facilities to say only X percent of facilities in country X actually responded. And there are various reasons for it. I think there needed to be more of a push by FDA to explain what the requirement was, to really make sure everybody knew what was coming. Our members were very involved working with FDA on this. We brought them in to speak at our conference to explain not just why, but what the actual technical requirements were going to be, what they expected from us, what we normally collect in terms of that data, and how it needed to be reformatted for FDA. And then as the first few reporting periods came in, we also sat down with the agency to sort of talk through lessons learned on our end and get a little bit from them too, to understand, okay, so we did report this, but if the customer is reporting something different, you have to understand the CDMO is only reporting its release. The customer may not consider that drug to be released because they're holding it in a warehouse, or it might be rejected on their end and they're not counting it as product, but we are. So you might get either duplicate information or inaccurate information, depending on how you correlate the facilities and the license holders' product reporting. So a lot of issues when it comes to this stuff. And this is sort of what I'm talking about.
Mhm.
We're understanding what the CDMO model is versus the innovator or the drug license owner.
How onerous is that reporting going to be for your members? Is there going to be more cost, more time to comply with that?
I think as we've talked with them and with Congress, it's data that we collect, but we're not necessarily collecting it in the structure and the format that FDA wants, and so and then the Congress is mandating. So it definitely involves more manpower. For some companies, it may involve adding or updating IT in certain ways.
Hmm.
But it becomes, if it becomes a necessary cost of doing business, and that becomes something that impacts the price model for CDMOs and impacts ultimately the cost of the drugs that they're producing. But yeah, it's more work. We understand where it's coming from. We're not griping and trying to get out from under requirements. In the case of some of the new legislation they want to put forth, we do feel that the license holder will probably have a more accurate picture of the supply chain information. They should be the ones reporting it. Um, Not that it would change the stuff that we're already collecting, but again, the things that we report may not be as accurate as what the license holder has, given the license holder's visibility into its own API supply chain.
Interesting. You touched on just now the fact that the business model for CDMOs is very different to that of innovators. I wonder if you could just unpack that a bit for us. So, if someone's working with a CDMO, what do they need to know about the business model? If they're looking for a partner, what should they be aware of?
That price is not the number one consideration.
Mm,
That is always a problem. I've been around the space for 24 years. And when I used to run a trade magazine in this space called Contract Pharma before moving 10 years ago to launch this association. The survey we always did each year of customer attitudes and CMO attitudes tended to price became a diminishing it wasn't as important a factor as it was when I was first starting out in
mm,
2000 and 1999. Quality, deliverables on time, et cetera, became more important. But it's always a factor, especially when CDMOs work in the entire space. We're not just doing high value innovator drugs. Some of our members are also doing lower price, we'll say commoditized generic drugs for their generic clients. And those areas particularly are very price sensitive, and it becomes difficult for the license holders of those drugs, especially with the US market for generics, to know and forecast what their product needs are going to be. And that tentativeness translates into their relationship with CDMOs, where it
mhm,
becomes difficult to guarantee certain business or to make sure you are definitely providing X, Y, or Z, or these are the things we need to have manufactured on these, by these dates. So there've been some concerns along those lines, just in terms of pricing pressures in certain areas of the pharma landscape overall. I would say ultimately a lot of CDMO considerations are mirroring larger pharma. Things that happen in larger pharma trickle down in different ways to the CDMO sector. The biggest area, like I said, is that price is not the number one
yep.
consideration. If you're trying to nickel and dime your CDMO way, way, way down, you will end up leaving the business, or they will end up not able to do everything you need because you are basically trying to use them as an in-house appendage without actually paying them.
Mhm.
Uh, Many, many years ago, it's a story I've told again at the Contract Pharma conference we used to put on. There was a company a sponsor side company that showed its R&D outsourcing practice around 2006 or so, and they were showing the reverse online bidding they were doing to get certain business for their
Oh, yeah.
R&D outsourcing. And yeah, they had 4 or 5 of CMO or CDMOs listed, and they showed 2 graphs. One was 0 hour when the bidding process was beginning, and the other was 2 hours later. And they had to rebid every 15 minutes and could see what everybody else's bids were. And the graphs just all dropped down to near zero, except for 2
Mm,
companies that dropped out partway through. And I was staring at this graph, just terrified. And the speaker said, "You have to understand, this isn't about going for the lowest price. This is about adding value." And I went upstairs to the CDMO exhibit and I started asking whether they'd gone through this. And every one of them said, "Oh, yeah, that's why we don't work with company X or
Yeah.
company Y, company Z, all of which are top 10 pharma companies, because they, once upon a time, pushed this sort of model." I think industry, the sponsor side, has moved away from that. I think the startup and smaller and virtual companies understand from the beginning, you need the security. You do not need the lowest price possible. You need to know that the company you're working with for development and ultimately manufacturing, that you use the term partner before, and that's
Hmm.
always a fraught term in this space because well, if you mention partner around CDMOs, they tend to grab their wallet and hold on tight. But I think with smaller and virtual companies, there is much more of that sense of partnership where they feel this is the CDMO we're working with. We're trusting them with our only molecule. We need to work closely together. They're still going to keep an eye on costs, of course,
Hmm.
but there is generally, I think, much more of a near partner relationship. Still not in the revenue sharing, et cetera, model, but much more of a sense of collaboration.
Yeah.
That tends to historically be the vibe.
What else do CDMOs hate?
The number one thing that came up when I first started the magazine and has held up this entire time is still product forecasting. They still say customer forecasts never hold up. It's always an issue. The thing they've come to hate in recent years was the Defense Production Act, and this is a small segment of the industry on the biologics end. Under the DPA, as it's known in the US, and I'm sure there are parallels to this in other countries, the federal government can send what are called rated orders to suppliers of various industrial products.
Okay.
When COVID vaccines were being produced, and those companies needed a lot of the raw materials, the ingredients, components, equipment, et cetera, FDA was sending these rated orders to the suppliers of those things. Problem is, those were also the components and equipment that biologics manufacturers need to make their products. And so there were issues for a while. And when we talk about supply chain disruptions and hiccups, this was one of the major ones in 2021 and around that time, as manufacturing was really ramping up for COVID vaccines. There were delays when it came to single-use systems, the bio bags and other components that biologic processors needed, whether they were in-house or CDMO. So no shortages, as far as I know, arose from that. There were concerns. A lot of members would reach out with questions as to whether I knew anybody who had component X, or if I could ask the industry or other partners, can anyone spare, this or that, because company Y really needed it. So in that respect, yeah, there are things they hate. That's a key one of them, and they all understood it was necessary. We knew vaccines had to be made, but
Hmm.
we also had to make sure that it wasn't going to lead to shortages of other key and critical products.
Yeah, absolutely. Taking a step back, over the last, I suppose, couple of decades, outsourcing has just grown and grown in terms of importance. And as the industry changes to a new era of smaller niche treatments, trusting your drug development with outsourced partners makes complete sense. So interested to get your views on that trend, but also at the same time, right now, September 2023 seems to also be a really difficult time in the CDMO space. It was just this week that Lonza's CEO stepped down. What's going on in terms of the market?
I think in that respect, you need to differentiate or go more granular with the
Hmm.
market. I think that and Lonza is not a member company of ours. I don't have relationships too closely with personnel there. From the outside, it seems as though some of the business disruption they've had, or lessened expectations, however it's framed, they've posted results that were lower than expected growth rates, tend to be around the cell and gene therapy space,
Hmm.
which is something that is predominantly outsourced because there are so many startups in that universe. That ties to a number of factors, some of which are pandemic related, some of which are new technology related. When it comes to the latter, FDA is still working to build up the regulatory framework for a lot of these cell and gene therapies. They are in the process of hiring reviewers because people who review applications for a certain a generic of ibuprofen probably aren't going to have the same expertise that is needed to review a particular allergenic gene therapy. So they need to build up that infrastructure. They need to issue certain guidance, and that's slowed down the process of reviewing a lot of these applications. And slowing that down means these products are not getting approved as quickly as they could. They don't move through phase 2, phase 3 as quickly as they could, also because there are protocols that are still being developed for how to do these sorts of trials. They're an incredibly promising set of technologies, but building up to accommodate that is going to be tough. And FDA, under the new Prescription Drug User Fee Act, has commitments to hire reviewers on the CBER side of things, the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, as opposed to CDER, which is Drug Evaluation and Research. CBER will be handling cell and gene therapies. They've got commitments to hire a lot more in that space. They need to work to really build up that sort of capability and capacity.
Are you hopeful that will speed things up? At the moment, it seems as though China can pretty much do whatever they like, really, and the rest of the world is being slowed down.
FDA is still the gold standard. There was a drug application in the US that was not accepted because all of the clinical data came from China. That was Lilly partnering, I think, with Beijing, and that was one of those. It caused another company that's entire business model was based on solely using Chinese clinical data for US FDA submissions to basically fold its operations. So there's a degree that, we might be overcautious, but these things they take time to develop, and the regulatory framework for them is still evolving. And we've seen it with even the ones that have been approved had contentious advisory committee meetings. So all of that leads to a slower process for this. The other side of that is R&D pipelines have also been hurt both by COVID itself, or the COVID lockdown period, where a lot of clinical trials were disrupted because you couldn't go to the clinic. A lot of things that would have been put into development couldn't be because certain clinical materials couldn't be made. Patients couldn't get out to see doctors. And following on that, partly as a result of COVID, we saw much higher interest rates occur throughout the U.S. and the world. And that led to some R&D funding drying up. And that, once again, leads to effects on the CDMO sector, where it hits pharma first and then reaches the CDMO side, where if fewer things are being developed, if fewer companies are getting funding, those projects don't get down to the CDMO, and that ends up hurting business somewhat. So we've seen some drying up in that area. We hope to see things improving soon. I'm no MBA or economist, but it seems as though there's a little thaw taking place, as some funding is opening up. But the CDMO sector obviously is dependent on those things making their way through the innovator side. So R&D drought becomes CDMO drought in some respects. There's still the commercial products to make, but the third factor for this, which I'm not qualified to comment on, but will nonetheless, is the impact of the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., which is meant to permit Medicare to begin negotiating prices on certain drugs. Some drug companies have said, well, this is going to stymie all of our R&D efforts, so we're leaving field X, Y, and Z. Other companies, I believe, made those comments prematurely, which may have kind of been these are R&D areas we're not super confident in anyway. The IRA is sort of a reason why we should exit them completely. So that becomes maybe more of a perception than an actual direct impact, but another thing that impacts R&D. And everything that impacts R&D impacts CDMOs ultimately.
So are you hopeful then that the sector will return back to growth?
I think so. The other area I should have mentioned is also just the COVID hangover / COVID cliff. We saw several of our members and other non-members in the CDMO space really rise up heroically to help with COVID vaccine and therapeutic production. And the drop-off of that, and I'm making my vaccine appointment for next week for the next booster here in the U.S., the drop-off from that there was no government support. We'll put it that way. There's a lot of support on the build-up side. Now that things are receding, they are falling back to, well, you're on your own. Good luck with preparing for the next pandemic that's coming. And that's been a real challenge. During early 21, we talked with a lot of different bodies about how to build in manufacturing capacity, how to make sure it's robust and flexible for conditions like this. And a lot of those lessons seem to be forgotten. We'll put it that way. There's a belief, and Operation Warp Speed in the US was a huge success in terms of not just developing those vaccines, but also through the Defense Production Act and various other contracting formulas, helping those companies make sure they could, the CDMOs, manufacture these products and get things out to the American people and the rest of the world. Afterwards, people start complaining about budgets, and government support starts to dissipate, and they're still arguing over reauthorizing the longstanding Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act here in the U.S., which one would think would be a great vehicle to really advance this and make sure that there's government funding and that we have new models in place to help support manufacturing infrastructure. The White House has called for, let's see, from the time of identifying an agent, a countermeasure against a biological threat, that within 130 days of IDing that molecule or whatever it is, we would have enough doses for everybody in the U.S. 200 days later, we would have enough for rest of world, which is an admirable goal, but not one that's achievable through existing manufacturing capacity, nor through existing government contracting models with license holders and CDMOs. So it's a sad lesson that we picked up. It's one that we sort of saw coming, that everybody would be very, rah-rah when we were all putting this stuff together and helping, save the world. Afterwards, people go back to their lives, I suppose.
How do you think that CDMOs are going to need to adapt? We might make some assumptions. One of them is that cell and gene therapy, as we've already talked about, those treatments are going to start coming through. The share of biopharma is forecast to steadily increase. Lots of big changes, which the industry is evolving to. Do you think that your members or the industry at large are ready for those changes?
I think they're in position. They're adapting. Capital is still accessible when it comes to making new investments, and there's still an awful lot. It's not sexy to talk about, but oral solid dosage drugs are still mighty important, as we see with when the Generic Industries Trade Association (AAM) puts out its figures. They still show in the U.S. that 90% of prescriptions are generic small molecule drugs, and that's a big savings on the U.S. healthcare system, and one that we help contribute to by manufacturing for them. But yeah, there are other modalities. I think one of the key areas that I'm interested in when it comes to when it comes to innovative drugs and where things are going, what we saw initially with Gilead and Sovaldi, and then with other orphan indications and other types of drugs, smaller patient populations, drugs that are cures rather than ongoing treatments, which are rarer and still in this world. But with something like Sovaldi, where they were curing hepatitis C, Gilead and its partners, the manufacturing for that was very front loaded, because you weren't treating them for the rest of their lives. You were, I believe, 7 weeks of treatment and done.
Yeah.
And so you're working with CMOs. You have to tell them you're going to have this massive, massive bolus of manufacturing, and over the next 4 or 5 years, it's going to shrink into nothing. And that's a very different business model than, okay, we're outsourcing with you and life cycle management as we move the product out of house. Things your volumes will stay fine. When generics come in, it'll start to diminish. Very different world in that respect. With orphan drugs, you're also looking at smaller volumes, again, with smaller patient populations. In some cases, a lot of these are high potency products, so having specialized capabilities is very important. We're seeing a growth, in addition to CGTs and other things along those lines. Antibody drug conjugates are finally fulfilling some of their promise. That requires 3 very, very distinct technologies in terms of high potency handling, monoclonal antibody manufacturing and then the conjugation technology of getting those together, plus all the ancillary handling requirements with that.
Mm.
So there are areas and there's room for growth, definitely. And we see in the industry still a significant amount of smaller to mid-tier CDMOs. They're still there. It's not an industry that really consolidated into 3 or 4 major companies. We do have major players like Catalent and Thermo Fisher Scientific, but there are a lot of smaller guys out there still. They work, whether it's oral solid dosage or sterile fill finish. We have several member companies who are pre-revenue, who are still building their first facilities in sterile injectable in the fill finish space. And there's demand, there's capacity that's being built. There are areas of significant growth still. There are a lot of issues with healthcare economics and, as I said, R&D funding that's going to redefine things. But I think there's plenty of opportunities for the CDMO sector. I'll also add as part of supply chain, as we were talking about earlier, the onshoring / friendshoring movement is something that we'll see what effect it ends up ultimately having. Knowing that a lot of dosage form manufacturing is already done in Western countries, as we'll say, North America, US, Canada, and EU, there's things can still move around. Companies are looking for more supply chain security, but there's also geopolitical considerations that license holders have, and they might be interested in moving manufacturing to particular regions that aren't currently served. So that might create opportunities for CDMOs in those sectors, in those particular geographic regions. But yeah, there's still opportunity. There's still R&D going on. There's still a lot of small molecule oral solid dosage, along with the higher value, sexier biologic and cell and gene therapy areas. I'll be interested also in seeing how biosimilars ultimately start to change the biologic landscape. For the longest time in the U.S. and in the EU, we didn't have real biologic competitiveness when it came to biosimilars. Eating away at some of the market share of these very high-end biologic drugs. So as that starts to happen and as CDMOs work in that space, that'll certainly be an area of potential change for that part of the sector.
Yeah.
The other big thing, nobody was predicting a $50 billion market in diabetes drugs that happen to cause weight loss. And that just showed up. I mean, we knew it was sort of coming with clinical data, but Ozempic and things like that could create a gigantic demand for certain types of manufacturing that just wasn't there before. Similarly, Alzheimer's treatments, if they ultimately prove worthwhile, the ones that are being approved now are monoclonal antibodies. The patient population for that will be absolutely enormous, which it seems as though it would justify some of the very, very, very large biologic capacity investments that have been done by a couple of companies in the East.
Take the Samsungs of the world.
Yeah, there's huge amount being built there, and I always kept wondering, why are you building that much stainless steel? Everything's moving towards single-use, smaller volume manufacturing. But as someone pointed out, if you have a monoclonal antibody that's going to be taken by a lot of people over 65, that is a pretty big patient population, and you're going to want a lot of capacity for that.
That's long-term planning, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's necessary for this world. It's for CDMOs, and especially in the biologic end, there's a lot of investment has to take place, a lot of consideration of what's coming down the pipeline. And there are gambles involved in this. You might end up with capacity you're not using for quite a while, but they seem to have enough insight into where product pipelines are, or where different countries are going when it comes to those approvals, that could lead to major use of a 15,000 liter stainless steel in an era that a lot of companies have moved to 2,000 liter bags.
It's fascinating, isn't it? There is so much going on. How do you keep up with everything that's happening?
A lot of different news feeds. I have sources in industry, people I talk to generally, and going back to trade shows in person again has been a great boon for that, because there's so much that you can just learn from shooting the breeze with somebody in the hallway. as opposed to having to schedule a Zoom call and have a reason for getting together. When it's somebody you've known for a bunch of years, and a few days from now we'll be at the Contract Pharma conference doing this, you just, what are you hearing? Who are you talking to? Do you understand why company X just did activity Y? But on top of that, I stay on top of various news wires. Weirdly, my LinkedIn feed, while everybody else in my world has their various social media platforms, um, most people in my life who are not pharma are really not pharma.
Mm.
Where I get an awful lot out of seeing what's going on in LinkedIn through not just the news announcements, but personnel, where people are going, what they're looking for. You start to build a sort of gestalt or a mosaic of sorts. Um, where you get all these little impressions of where things are going in the industry beyond the big picture stuff. And
Hmm.
you start to see the impact it's going to have on companies, or when something gets announced, it's something that's already clear to you why company X did activity Y.
Do you see there being a time when pharma and biopharma will totally merge, so we don't have to talk about the Pharma and Biopharma Outsourcing Association? It would certainly make my life a lot easier if I didn't have to always say pharma and bio, pharma and bio.
When I was at Contract Pharma, I began with I did a report on the top 20 pharma and top 10 biopharma companies, except I didn't have a definition of what made a biopharma.
Hmm.
And I was going by companies that were calling themselves biopharma. And then after a year or two, I realized it was just investor talk. That biopharma was just a way of making it seem like making it seem sexy for investors. So I came up with the criteria, and this is for the license holder side, not for CDMOs, because if I ranked our CDMOs, we would have lost half the advertising base. So I decided you're a biopharma if more than 50% of your pharma revenue comes from large molecule and vaccines.
Okay.
It was completely arbitrary as points went, but it was consistent from there on. And it ended up moving AbbVie from pharma over to biopharma because Humira became, I think, 65% of their revenue one year. And so that was, okay, this is now a biopharma based on my arbitrary but solid definition. It is just terminology. A lot of it, people use biotech also. They throw these terms around.
Hmm.
You can once again go with pharma equals small molecule, biopharma equals large. Even there are drugs that are very large small molecules and almost turn into biologics of their own. Most vaccines are large molecule, but certain ones actually carry a small molecule capability within them. So yeah, it's all arbitrary. It's a lot of things in this industry were inherited terminology. A lot of things are inconsistent from company to company when it comes to using those definitions. So, we sort of use them and play along and have a consensus that we all know what we mean.
Yeah. It's all life sciences.
Yeah, that's a good one too. Except when I started, that included ag in addition to pharma and biopharma. So if you said life sciences, you might be also doing agricultural applications. See, again, everything can be taken one way or this way or that way. So healthcare, but that turns into downstream,
hospitals and everything.
doctors, all that. So yeah, just bio/pharma is the shortest version visually you can come up with.
Gil, I've really enjoyed speaking to you. Before we go, could you just talk a little bit about your virtual memory show, please? Because you're not just purely pharma and bio, are you? You've got another side to you.
I usually, I hide this, but if you Google my name, it shows up before PBOA does. Since 2012, I've been doing a podcast it's a conversation podcast with writers, artists, cartoonists, musicians, publishers, creative and cultural figures, basically. Around 2014, I went to doing it weekly. And until the pandemic, I always did these shows in person. I would just sit down with a guest. We would talk for an hour or two, record the whole thing, and I post it each week. With the pandemic, I've had to start doing remote ones like we're doing now. But I still like getting out and just sitting down with a creative person and having a conversation about who they are, how they got that way. If there's a new project, we'll sort of center the conversation or start the conversation around that. But yeah, it's the balance in my life. which is arguable. You could easily say I'm quite unbalanced given the amount of work I put into both of these things, but it does give me more perspective. And I mean, this will be a weird thing to say, but it actually helps when it comes to with public speaking, even with some of the lobbying activity I do in general. The skills I've learned from sitting down with someone I don't know every week, and there have been repeat guests and people I've recorded with multiple times. We're more familiar, et cetera. But sitting down with somebody I've never met and having an hour or two of conversation and just reading their face while we talk turns out to have a lot of applications when it comes to the PBOA side of things. Sitting down with congressional staff or FDA personnel, getting up during a public meeting to speak during open comments. I would not do as well if I didn't have the reps and the background that I have from making the virtual memories show every week. So that's been I didn't realize that was a benefit until I was at a FDA public meeting in 2014 where PBOA was just starting out, and there was a public comments session on a subject we were interested in. I had never gotten up and done this before, but I had to because it was an area we cared about, and two of my members were shoving me from behind up to the podium. And I got up there, and my leg was shaking. I was a little nervous, and then I looked at the FDA panel, and I thought, there's a microphone in front of them. There's a microphone in front of you. You do this every week on the podcast.
Yeah.
Just go. And my leg was still shaking a little, but I found myself much more confident. And since then, I can do this much more easily. Nowadays, I'm much more comfortable with that environment, as long as it's a subject you know about. Even when I had to testify in front of Congress for my one and only time so far, I felt okay because I was used to not just the podcast, but at that point doing my introductions and recording an intro every week to make the show, sitting down and hammering out a 5-minute piece about the over-the-counter Monograph Reform Act wasn't as difficult. I was still a little nervous because I don't do podcasts when I'm under oath and at risk of perjury, but that one worked out pretty well. And yeah, so it's been it keeps my artistic side balanced with this professional pharma side of things. And I think they both feed each other ultimately.
Well, I think that's great advice if anyone is going to be speaking to the FDA or even testifying before Congress. Record a podcast first.
Yeah, it helps. At least it gives you something to listen back at. It's the worst thing in the world to listen to your own voice. But after 550 episodes of this, I've gotten accustomed to the dumb things I'm going to say and how I can accentuate the smart things my guests say.
Thanks to Gil Roth for such a fascinating interview. You can find out more about the PBOA by heading to pharma-bio.org. And as ever, head to pharmasource.global for reports, events, and other episodes of this podcast. Thank you for listening.